Hi, my name's Elaine from Foodbod Sourdough, and in this video I'm going to be answering the most frequently asked questions that I receive about making sourdough. In my kitchen with lots of dough. Hi, and welcome back to my kitchen. In this video, my aim is to answer the most frequently asked questions I receive about making sourdough. So just to clarify, this video is about making your loaves and your dough. We have a previous video, a separate video, which is the frequently asked questions about starters. So if you're here looking for answers about your starter, please check out our other video. In this one, we're talking about the dough and the loaves. Our lovely, lovely sourdough. So all of these questions, the things I'm going to refer to, are all based on the questions that I receive most on a regular basis. They are what forms my books, the answers in my books, all the information, because I know they're the things that concern people the most when they're making sourdough. So I've got some doughs to show you, some bits that hopefully will give you a reference, but the aim here is to answer as many questions as I can. So it means I don't have an example of everything, but you have most of it. So one of the first questions, and everything relates back to dough when it comes to sourdough. So whenever people email me or contact me and ask me a question about their loaf or the final outcome, my question will always go back to being about the dough and about how your dough behaved, because that's where it all begins. So one of the questions I'm asked the most, and one of the ones that I cover the most, is why did my dough spread? So if you have had a loaf where when you've turned it out, the dough has spread and therefore the loaf hasn't held its shape, a lot of this video, a lot of the information I'm going to share is going to give you answers for that, because it tends to be what the main concern is why hasn't a loaf held its shape? So pretty much everything that I'm going to show you, to make sure I try and cover it all, is going to give you what your answer is to that, because there's always a specific reason. There's always a particular reason, which is why when someone asks me, I will always backtrack and ask certain questions. So it always refers back to the dough, the flour you used, the water you used, how long you proved it for, your room temperature. They tend to be the key things. So if you have had a loaf that hasn't turned out as you expected, you feel it's wider and flatter than you expected, then these are going to give you your answers. We'll also talk about what produces a gummy loaf, which will be part of it. We'll talk about seeing what dough looks like when it's proved and different things. So I'm trying to make sure I cover everything, even though for some of it, there's all the same answers. So let's start off with, what does a well-proved dough look like? And this is all going to pertain to the question of why did my loaf spread, or why didn't my loaf grow as I expected it to? So this here, this is perfectly proved dough. So this dough has been made using my master recipe. So it's got 50 grams of water, 350 grams of starter, 350 grams of water, 500 grams of strong white bread flour. I've used this, I've used Churchill's, and salt to taste. And this has been proving in my kitchen for the required amount of time it needs to get to this point. So this is a perfectly happily proved bowl of dough. There's another one, so you can see. These are really happily proved doughs. So we've got a nice smooth surface, slightly upwardly domed, couple of little bubbles maybe, that's fine. We don't want any more than that. But this is very happily proved dough. So for people that struggle to know when their dough has been fully proved, the easy guide is you want your dough to double in size. So a really good tip is when you finish your dough, when you finish pulling it together, before you leave it to prove, is take a photo, then you have a comparison. Alternatively, if you use the bowls that I do, and this bowl is a Duralex stackable bowl. It's 23 centimeters in diameter, 9 centimeters deep. And when your dough is coming up to here, or even between this lip and the top of the bowl, it's perfect size. That is a great size for a perfectly proved bowl of dough. But alongside that, we also want a good structure. So when you then pull this together to create your ball of dough that's going to go into the banneton, you want it to be able to hold its shape. You want to be able to pull this into a ball you can hold in your hand. It's got enough structure that you can just hold it as a ball. If you pulled this into a tight ball and then it's spreading in your hand, that's telling you it's too soft and that it's going to struggle to hold its shape. So one of the first reasons that people's dough often spreads when they're making a loaf, especially if people are new to sourdough, is because they just haven't been firm enough with it. It's a really, really simple one. You've made this beautiful dough, everything's gone to plan. You've pulled it together, you think you've put it in your banneton, you've proved it, you turn it out and it's spread. The really simple thing is because you just haven't been firm enough with it. So when I say firm enough, I mean when you handle it. So this is me pulling the dough into a ball ready to go into the banneton. I mean be firm with it. So all this, often I'll get people saying, oh, I didn't want to squash the bubbles. I didn't want to ruin it. You're not ruining it. In fact, if you're too gentle with it, that's what's going to spoil your outcome. You need to be firm, and I mean firm with your dough, so that you get to a point where you have a ball of dough like this and it sits in your hand quite happily. And that is then what's going to go into your banneton. So there's the first answer. Are you being firm enough with your dough? And none of this, I didn't want to squash it. I didn't want to be too heavy-handed. Be heavy-handed. It's okay. Because if your dough has got enough power and structure in it, you can't squash it anyway because it's got too much power in it. And actually, you could sit on it, you could pummel it, and if it's a well-made dough, it's still going to bake well. So that's the first thing, is make sure that you're pulling that together really, really firmly. Okay? I'm going to cover that over and come back to that when we've finished filming. So this is what we want. We want this lovely, structured, smoothish surface. This is a beautifully proved bowl of dough. So if you want a visual reference, that's it. And that's what you'll see in the photos in my books and everything. This is what it looks like. So let me show you an alternative. A couple of the key reasons why your dough gets to a point where it would be too soft to be able to hold it in that smooth, lovely, firm ball of dough is if your dough has had too much water in it from the beginning or it's overproved. So, not all flour is the same. Not all flour absorbs water in the same way. So my recipe is based on 350 grams of water for 500 grams of flour. Works perfectly with the flours that I use as a standard strong white bread flour. If you're using a different brand of flour, you may need a different amount of water. For example, if you use supermarket flours, you'll need less water because they don't hold their water in the same way. If you've got soft water, you'll need less water. And all of these tips are all written, they're on my website, they're in detail. My latest book, The Sourdough Bible, has all of this in utter detail, written form for you as a reference. So if you've got soft water or filtered water, you need to use 25 grams less water. If you're using a different make of flour, something maybe a bit cheaper from the supermarket, or if you're using an organic strong white bread flour, often you need less water, so use 25 grams less water. Otherwise, you can leave the water content the same. So that's one of the reasons why dough will spread, because it just needs less water with your flour. And it's an easy thing to try. If you are trying to figure out what's going on, it's an easy fix. Just try less water. So let me show you what happens if you have this monster. I have been nurturing, we have been waiting to film, and I've been nurturing this to show what a wet dough looks like, and it's kept on proving and it's escaped. So if you have a dough like this, it wouldn't necessarily have escaped the bowl, and this we'll talk about proving in a minute. This one's not about overproving. This has got far too much water in it for this flour. So if you get to the point like this and it's a sticky mess and it's literally going to collapse the second that you touch this, okay? It will be the same with an overproved dough. I'm going to show you overproving as well, so it will behave in a similar way. But one reason that this can happen is literally because there's too much water for your flour, and it's just not going to hold anything. So the best thing to do if you've got a monster like this is you can try pulling it into a ball if you want, but it's going to be very challenging. The best thing to do with this would be to pull it together as best you can, slop it into a pan and bake it as focaccia. Because it will still make a great bread like that. You could even, if you wanted to, try pulling it into some kind of shape, put it in a loaf pan and bake it as a sandwich loaf. But if you've got dough like this, it is either too wet or it's overproved. So on that point, let me show you another one as an example, whilst I just wipe some of this off my hands. What I'm going to say is, don't be too quick to throw it out. The amount of people that will message me and say, oh, I've thrown the dough away. Don't ever throw dough away. Dough can always be used, even if it's more liquid than this. Just mix in some yogurt and turn it into flatbreads. Mix in some milk and turn it into pancakes. But don't ever throw it away. You've worked hard on creating that dough, so don't ever throw it away. So you've either got the option of your dough is just too wet, or it's possibly overproved. And here we go. We have got a delivery at my front door. This is what happens when you're filming in your home kitchen. So excuse the knocking on the door. Hopefully they will just leave it. Let's get rid of that one. So this is to show you, it's going to look very, very similar to the last one, but this is going to show you what an overproved dough looks like. So this, again, look at that. If you have dough that looks like this, it's got a really bubbly surface. Everybody thinks, oh, it looks fantastic. Yeah, it's exciting. It's lively. You can see that your starter works. But the second that you get a bubbly surface, that's a red flag. If you have a bubbly surface, your dough is either too wet, like that one was, because that one was bubbly before it went mad, or it's overproved, as this one is. So this is great, but this is an overproved dough. And again, this will be very, very difficult to handle. If you're trying to pull it into any kind of shape, this is going to be, again, sticky and hard to work with. So your dough will overprove if, as I intentionally did for this one, you leave it for 36 hours to prove, or it's been far too warm in your kitchen for your dough, or you have left it too long, or both. So to understand the way that proving works, it's the marriage between how much starter you have in your dough, your room temperature, and how long it's proved for. So those are the key components. So my master recipe is based on using 50 grams of starter and being in a room between 18 to 20 degrees centigrade, 64 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit for 8 to 10 hours. That's the standard. That doesn't mean that you need to manipulate your home kitchen to only be those temperatures. What it means is to understand that if any differential there, if any part of that equation changes, you'll get a different outcome. So if I used more starter and left it at that room temperature, it will be proved faster. If I use less starter at that room temperature, it will take longer. Likewise, if I use my 50 grams of starter and it's colder overnight, it will take longer. If I use my 50 grams of starter and it's hotter overnight, it will risk overproving. So, and then that's all easy to fix. You can easily manage that. So this is why I recommend having a thermometer in your kitchen. If you have a thermometer like mine that will show you what the temperature's been across 24 hours, you can see what the temperature is overnight. It helps you to manage this. This is also why it helps to make notes. Take a note of what time you leave your dough to prove, what the room temperature is. Take a note the next morning of what the outcome is, again, what the room temperature's been and what the time is, and you'll see a pattern. So your dough will overprove if you have got a warm kitchen. So if you live somewhere warm, or if you've got an Aga, which is quite typical in the UK, something that's making your kitchen warm, all you need to do when you're proving your dough is move it away from the heat. If you've got a warm kitchen, put it in a cooler room, or just use less starter. Starter is the power in your dough. If you give it less power, the proving will be slower and you don't need to worry about getting up at 3 in the morning. No one should ever get up at 3 in the morning because of their dough, unless they're a professional baker and that's what they get paid for. There's no reason to interrupt your sleep. So if you wake up to dough like this was, all bubbly and all over the place, it's overproved either because it was left to prove for too long, or it was too hot, or both. So those are the key components to the success of your dough. My master recipe is written based on starting it in the evening to be able to then manage your dough the next morning. So sometimes people will message me and go, oh, I'm trying your recipe, I've just mixed up my dough. And it's 12 or 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And I would go back and say, okay, you started that really early. By doing that, you're adding extra time. Dough has a finite life. The recipe has timings on it for a reason. Now you can move them around the clock, no problem. You can change when you prove and how you choose to prove. But if you're going to do that, you either need to move it to earlier in the day or later. If you start dough in the middle of the day, you're going to have to manage that dough because it will overprove, because you're adding extra time on. And either you are getting up in the middle of the night or you're going to have to do something different. So it's understanding that it's the amount of starter you use plus your room temperature gives you the time. So you don't need to manage all of that, just understand it. So if you have woken up to massively overproof dough like this, again, see if you can pull it into anything. See if you can save it. Pull it into a ball, into a shape, put it in a loaf pan, bake it as a sandwich loaf, or turn it into focaccia. So again, all is not lost. So whether it's sloppy because it's too wet or it's overproofed, it doesn't mean it can't be used. But they are very, very typical reasons why a dough will spread and why it's not turned out as you hope it will. Likewise, the alternative is if your dough hasn't grown very much and then you go on to put it in a banneton and bake it, you'll get an underproved loaf. The best way for you to see examples of those and photos of those are to look in my book, because I've made sure that you've got visual guides for that so that you can have a look. So if your dough spreads, they're typically the reasons. Alternatively, I made this dough a couple of days ago. I put it in the fridge, in the banneton, and it has been there for 2 days, which is why it has grown like this. So a lot of people will ask me, how much should it grow in the fridge? Doesn't matter how much your dough grows in the fridge, it's about how it bakes. So a lot of people worry that their dough hasn't grown enough in the banneton, in the fridge. Really, you want it to be just kind of level or a slight dome over your banneton. But it doesn't matter if it doesn't reach that, as long as it bakes okay. This is going to be over. So this is now a bit challenged because I've purposely left it there for a bit longer. If you can hear the feet pitter-pattering around, the dog's in the kitchen again. So there's every chance that when you turn this out, this is going to spread. So let me show you as an example. Typically I would turn this straight into the pan, but I'm going to do it on the table so that you can see. So because this has grown so much and it's been in the fridge for so long, when I turn this out, okay, if you can see, that is already starting to splodge, technical term. It's starting to spread. It's losing its shape that we've crafted so carefully because I've left it so long in the fridge to show you. So this could happen either because it's been in the fridge too long, you didn't pull it into a tight enough ball in the first place, or it's an overproved dough, which is this is becoming because it's been in the fridge for so long. So this gives me the perfect opportunity to answer another question. So I will often have people saying, oh, why couldn't I score it properly? Why didn't my scores open up when I baked it? And people are immediately ready to blame their lane. Usually that's what people go, oh, I think I need a new blade. It's very, very rare that that's the reason, but yes, you should keep an eye on your blade and how often you change it. But usually, if scores don't open up or it drags when you cut it, it's because the dough is so soft like this. And therefore, you're going to have trouble scoring it because it's going to drag and pull. Or as soon as you cut into it, it's going to start filling out. So, excuse the dog tripping around looking for food. When you bake this isn't going to show the score. This isn't going to open up because it's lost all of its structure and you can see it's turning into a pancake. Now, I will still bake this because I'm not going to waste it. And it will gain whatever it can from being in the pan. But this is your typical reason why people can't score. That's, of course, as is typical when you try and show an example, that scored it quite cleanly. But if you are scoring and it drags, usually it's because of the dough, not the lane. So it's about, always comes back to the dough. Always comes back to your dough. So that's covering, we're showing then why your scores don't open up, often because it's your soft dough. Why loaves spread or why dough doesn't come together. Either it's too wet from too much water in your flour, or it's overproved, or you're just not putting it together tightly enough. Another question will often be, why did my dough stick to my banneton? Again, usually because the dough's too sticky. If your dough's really sticky from overproving or too much water, it can often stick to your banneton. Doesn't matter how much rice flour you put in it. Another question will often be, why have I got a gummy loaf? So if your loaf is gummy inside, either you needed to wait longer before you sliced into it, or it's underproved or overproved, or you just need to bake it differently. Very often the loaves just need baking for longer. And again, the timing that I give for baking loaves is based on my oven, and all ovens are different. So if your loaf comes out quite pale, it may need to bake it for longer. And that's okay. You can add a lot more time on to baking sourdough than you think. It's very hard to overbake sourdough. Or if your loaf is coming out quite dark, but it's still gummy inside, try turning your oven down a bit and bake for a bit longer. I see that quite a lot. But on that same point then, this is a loaf that I have purposely challenged to show you some examples. So, as you can see, the scores didn't open up. Yes, it burst here, but the scores didn't open up because this is a very soft dough. But you can also see it burst here, and it's quite uneven because the shape wasn't very tight. It needed to be pulled into a tighter shape. It's also quite dark. So whether or not it's gummy inside will remain to be seen, and James will find that out later. But another thing that you'll see, the base. So I often get the question, very often get the question of, why is the base on my loaf so dark and hard to slice into? And again, that often comes down to the oven. So if your oven has an uneven heat, or if it's a gas oven and the element comes from the bottom, it's hitting the base of your loaf first, often it will bake the base faster and sooner before the rest of it. In that situation, put an oven tray or a cookie sheet on the rack further down the oven, or even sit it underneath the pan you're baking on, or a stone, something so that you protect the base of your loaf before the heat comes up to the top. So this shows you, this is what I mean when I'm talking about scores not opening up very much. This is a prime example, which is what you will get if your loaf is overproved, the dough's too wet, or you just haven't pulled it together tightly enough. Or you just haven't scored deeply enough. You really need to score a lot deeper than you think. What else have we got on my list? A couple of people several people have asked how tall a loaf should be. It shouldn't be anything. A loaf shouldn't look a certain way. It shouldn't be a certain height. All that matters is that you have a loaf that you're happy to eat. So there isn't a specific shape it should be, height it should be. It should just be bread that you love and that you can eat. So don't focus on heights. Don't focus on holes. Don't focus on ears, because none of them add flavour to it. What's another one? How to tell if your dough is fully proved. Hopefully that will show you from having a nice structured dough. The poke test. When you make a standard yeasted bread, you can do a poke test to see if your dough is fully proved when you make an indent into it. That doesn't work with this, because our dough, once it's fully proved, after an overnight prove, it's too sticky. That won't work. And then when you prove it in the fridge, a poke test only really works on room temperature dough. So forget the poke test on this one. Likewise, when people put the dough together, you doesn't need to create a windowpane effect. So if you don't know what that means, don't worry about it, because you don't need one. People often ask, why is it going into the fridge? This is the reason it's going into the fridge. So, you know, that this doesn't happen typically. I left it in the fridge purposely longer to show you. But if you pulled your dough into the banneton, left the banneton on the side to prove again, and then turned it out to bake, it will do that, because it hasn't got any extra shape. So the time in the fridge is to develop flavour and to give your dough extra shape, to really firm it up. Let me see. I think, another one that I'm often asked is, how can I soften the crust? So people often ask how to soften the crust because they're finding it too tough to slice and tough to eat. There's been the odd broken tooth, sadly. If you want to soften the crust of your sourdough loaf, when it comes out the oven, it's freshly baked, put it on a rack and then cover it in a clean tea towel and leave it to cool. And then as it cools, the steam will soften the outer crust. Alternatively, replace half of the water with milk and it will give you a softer finish. So any loaf that's got fats in it, whether it's milk, oil, butter, will give you a softer crust. So there's some easy answers for that one, again, in my book. I'm often asked about how to start using new flours. We have separate video coming about that. When to add extra ingredients, and we have a separate video that's going to come about that. So keep an eye out for those. Excuse me, I'm talking a lot. Another question I'm often asked is how to make a loaf more sour, sometimes less sour. If you go back to our previous video about frequently asked questions about starters, I'm talking there about how to get more flavour in your starter, which will help you have a more sour loaf. Also, if you use whole grain flour, that will give you a more sour loaf. If you want a less sour loaf, a really easy thing to do is to add some dairy. Again, if you replace half the water with milk, you'll get a less sour loaf. If you don't prove it for too long in the fridge, you'll get a less sour loaf. So typically, when my dough is in the banneton and in the fridge, I want it to be in the fridge for a minimum of 3 hours to give it the shape that I want. But you could then leave it for up to 24 hours. And that's how you'll develop more flavour. So if you want less flavour, take it out at your 3 hours. If you want more flavour, leave it for longer. Another question, what do I do if I don't have a banneton? If you don't have a banneton, find a similar size bowl, line it with a tea towel and flour your tea towel. And it needs to be a similar size. So this is another reason, actually, sometimes why you'll have widespread loaves. If your banneton is too big for your dough, or you're using a bowl that's too big, when you turn it out, the loaf will spread. So make sure that you check the size of your banneton as well. So this is a Brot form wood pulp banneton made to hold dough of 500 to 750 grams of dough, and it measures 21.5 centimeters across and works perfectly with my master recipe. One last thing, do you need to preheat the oven? No. There's a lot of recipes around that have you preheating your oven at crazy temperatures for an hour with nothing in it, putting in pans and preheating pans, so you're dealing with very hot pans. You don't need to do any of that. I don't preheat the oven, I don't heat the pan, everything goes in cold. So no, you don't need to preheat anything. If you want to know more about that, do look back at my master recipe video and look at anything I've ever written. Everything goes in from a cold start. So I'm just checking. I think we've answered everything, but usually the main queries when it comes to bread and it comes to dough usually all relate back to the same thing. It's understanding the connection between how much starter you have in your dough, the room temperature you're proving at, and for how long. So just remember, you have full control of that. If you're worried about overproving, just use less starter. It's really, really simple. If you've started a dough too early, you think it's going to overprove during the night, stick the whole bowl of dough in your fridge, go off to bed quite happily. It will keep proving to a certain extent, then it will slow down. In the morning, take it out, let it come to room temperature and finish off the process. So you are always in control of it. Check to see just how much water works with your flour. And again, I have a whole list of flours on my website and details on there that will answer that. If you're using the flours that I use, all of the water amounts work perfectly with it, assuming hard water. If you're using soft water or filtered water, you will need less. And I think that just about covers all of it. So make notes. It's my biggest recommendation, is always make notes. And go back through this video, look at our one about starters as well, and hopefully you'll find all of your answers. But just be firm with your dough, don't be scared of it, score it deeply, and hopefully you'll be enjoying some super fabulous sourdough. Let us know how you get on, and I hope that this has been helpful. And as I said, if you want a written reference, the book that I have got the most comprehensive information in is the Sourdough Bible. It's all in there, and that will answer all of these questions and more. So I hope that's been useful for me in my kitchen with lots of dough that I now need to sort out. Happy baking!